Dawn arrives without announcement. A wash of light spreads across an empty field, touching grass that bends gently beneath the wind. There are no monuments here, no shattered walls. If someone passed through, they would see nothing unusual, and yet stillness can be deceptive. History usually begins with noise, trumpets, banners, explosions, the clash of armies. We are taught that great wars leave scars impossible to ignore. Ruins rise as warnings, names are carved into stone, records multiply. But what if the most devastating conflict humanity ever faced did not end in spectacle? What if it ended in something far more unsettling? Absence. Imagine a war so vast, so destabilizing, that survival depended not on remembering it, but on forgetting. Not a battle between neighboring kingdoms, not a struggle recorded in scrolls or etched into temple walls, but something older, something that pressed against the edges of human continuity itself. If such a catastrophe occurred, would the survivors preserve every detail? Or would they soften it, reshape it, allow memory to dissolve just enough to make the future livable? Across continents separated by oceans and centuries, ancient stories speak of endings. They whisper of skies that burned, of waters that swallowed entire cities, of gods locked in furious struggle. Civilizations with no contact describe golden ages that collapsed abruptly, as if perfection had been interrupted by an invisible hand. These tales surface in different languages, carved into different landscapes, yet their echoes feel strangely aligned. Flood, fire, darkness, renewal. But pause for a moment. Why do these narratives converge? Why does the memory of overwhelming destruction appear again and again, carried by cultures that could not have borrowed from one another? It is easy to dismiss such patterns as coincidence or metaphor. Easier still to frame them as symbolic lessons about morality or pride. Yet the repetition lingers. Perhaps the question is not whether the stories are exaggerated. Perhaps the question is why they survived at all. Official history moves with confidence. It offers timelines, dynasties, carefully arranged chapters that stretch neatly from origin to present. Within those chapters, there are wars, collapses, migrations, but none that feel absolute, none that suggest a break so profound it required humanity to begin again with altered memory. Still, silence itself can be evidence. There are moments in every archive where clarity fades. Periods historians label as dark, not because nothing happened, but because so little remains. We accept these gaps as natural erosion. Time destroys parchment. Fire consumes libraries. Empires rise and fall. Yet, what if some absences are not accidental? What if forgetting was not merely the consequence of decay, but an instinctive response to trauma? Memory is not fixed stone. It bends. It compresses. It rewrites itself to protect those who carry it. On a personal scale, we understand this well. Painful events blur at the edges. Details soften. The mind shields itself in subtle ways. Now, imagine that process unfolding across generations, carried by entire populations seeking stability after devastation too immense to recount. A field at sunrise does not reveal what once trembled beneath it. Grass grows over foundations. Wind erases tracks. Silence expands until it feels permanent. And in that silence, a strange possibility begins to form. That the greatest war in human history may not be the one most recorded, but the one least remembered. If something so vast once fractured the human story, traces would not announce themselves loudly. They would not arrive with banners or headlines. They would linger in patterns, in inconsistencies, in quiet fractures within the timeline we trust. And it is toward those fractures that the story now turns. If the field at dawn felt undisturbed, history itself does not share that calm. Beneath the surface of our timelines, something shifts. The story we inherit appears continuous, a smooth ascent from primitive beginnings to towering cities and satellite networks. Yet when examined closely, that ascent flickers. It hesitates. It stumbles in places no one quite explains, moves slowly across the centuries, and subtle inconsistencies begin to gather. Techniques of construction appear with remarkable precision, then vanish for generations. Stone blocks once fitted with mathematical elegance are later replaced by rougher hands, as though the knowledge guiding them had thinned. Entire engineering traditions fade into obscurity, only to re-emerge long after their supposed origin, rediscovered as if new. Is not dramatic. No proclamation announces the loss. No chronicler writes, "Today we forgot." Instead, the record grows quiet. Libraries burn, sometimes by accident, sometimes by decree. Manuscripts decay. Oral traditions fragment. And in the space left behind, something deeper settles. Not destruction alone, but discontinuity. Why do so many civilizations describe eras of brilliance, followed by periods they themselves call dark? How does a culture capable of monumental architecture enter centuries where even basic techniques seem diminished? We are told of invasions of droughts. All true, perhaps. Yet the pattern repeats across continents, with curious rhythm. Civilization does not rise like a staircase. It pulses, it expands, tightens, loosens, then gathers again. The illusion of steady progress fades when viewed from a distance. Instead, the arc resembles something interrupted and resumed again. Midway through these reflections, a quieter possibility begins to form. What if what historians describe as collapse was not merely decline, but aftermath? Aftermath implies a preceding force, something powerful enough to disrupt systems beyond simple mismanagement or regional conflict. Aftermath carries weight. Even when the event itself is blurred, there are gaps in the record that stretch wider than expected, periods where clarity fades not for a year, nor a decade, but for centuries. Reconstruction fills these spaces carefully. Timelines are stitched together with inference. Chronologies overlap, adjust, compress. None of it demands conspiracy. History remains rooted in evidence, in careful interpretation. But incompleteness is different from inaccuracy. To admit a fragment is missing does not deny what remains. It invites deeper attention. Consider how knowledge disappears. It rarely vanishes all at once. It fragments. Trade routes dissolve. In peaceful times, these losses are gradual. Yet, in moments of widespread disruption, the erosion accelerates. Entire systems can fall silent within a generation. Then, centuries later, the same knowledge returns, reconstructed, renamed, celebrated as innovation, printing, metallurgy, navigation, astronomical observation. Often the rediscovery feels astonishing, as though humanity leaped forward after long dormancy. But dormancy suggests sleep, and sleep suggests the possibility of prior waking. Across the globe, independent cultures record phases of flourishing, followed by sudden simplicity. Complex governance gives way to smaller settlements. Written language retreats into isolated circles before spreading again. If each episode were isolated, the explanation might rest easily. Yet the alignment is difficult to ignore. The timeline we inherit begins to feel less like a seamless ribbon and more like fabric sewn after tearing. The stitches are precise. The pattern appears whole. But look closely, and the mending reveals itself. The question is not whether humanity progressed. It clearly did. The question is why progress repeatedly fractures, as if some unseen pressure resets the board. If these breaks are real, then what survives each interruption must have been chosen, preserved, or salvaged. And if that is true, the story of our past is not only about what happened, but about what endured. It is toward those silent custodians of memory that we now turn. When the thread of history frays, someone must gather the pieces, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Across centuries, knowledge has never moved freely on its own. It has passed through hands, careful hands, cautious hands, scribes bent over parchment, priests guarding sacred texts, archivists deciding what was worth copying again and what could quietly fade. We often imagine power as domination, but there is another form of power that is quieter and far more subtle. The power to preserve, the power to omit, the power to frame the story that will be told when the dust settles. After conquest, chronicles are revised. After revolutions, after dynasties fall, origin stories are adjusted to match new legitimacy. These patterns are well documented, openly acknowledged. Yet when viewed together, they reveal something deeper. History is not only recorded, it is curated. Consider A world emerging from catastrophe, not a minor collapse, not a regional famine, but an event that destabilizes everything. Infrastructure, belief systems, trust itself. In such a world, people do not ask for complexity. They ask for coherence. They want to know why it happened. They need assurance that it will not happen again. And above all, they need a story they can live inside without fear. Narrative becomes architecture. If advanced knowledge once contributed to devastation, if technologies, systems, or ambitions led to self-destruction, would survivors preserve that knowledge in full detail? Or would they soften it, compartmentalize it, wrap it in allegory? Would they transform technical memory into myth, turning precision into parable? The idea feels unsettling, yet strangely logical. Forgetting does not always signal ignorance. Sometimes it signals restraint. There is a difference between erasing history and restructuring it. Erasure implies removal. Restructuring implies adaptation. And adaptation is how societies survive. Imagine councils of survivors, not conspirators, not villains, simply people tasked with rebuilding order. They would face impossible choices. Which teachings remain safe? Which discoveries risk repeating disaster? Which explanations calm fear and which reopen wounds? Over time, simplification would be inevitable. Complex systems reduced to symbolic narratives, precise chronologies compressed into eras, detailed accounts condensed into origin myths, not to deceive, but to stabilize. This is where the possibility of a civilizational memory reset begins to crystallize. Not a single coordinated act, but a gradual convergence of survival instincts. Priests, safeguarding fragments they deemed sacred. Scholars copying texts that aligned with emerging order. Rulers endorsing narratives that unified fractured populations. Layer upon layer, the story shifts slightly. Not enough to feel fabricated, just enough to become livable. The result would not look like censorship. It would look like continuity. Yet beneath that continuity, subtle compression would persist. Gaps stitched closed. Uncomfortable knowledge reframed. Dangerous clarity dissolved into symbolism. And generations later, descendants would inherit a history that felt ancient and complete, unaware of the restructuring that made it stable. The realization carries weight. If rewriting was strategic rather than malicious, the question changes. It is no longer who altered the record in secret. It becomes whether forgetting was part of humanity's recovery after devastation. Who decides which truths are too dangerous to remember? Perhaps the answer is simpler than expected. Those who rebuild. If this pattern has repeated before, it reframes the beginning of civilization itself. The story we consider origin may not mark humanity's first rise, but its first successful recovery after something larger. History, then, may not begin at dawn. It may begin at daybreak after a long and catastrophic night. And if memory was reshaped to secure stability, traces of the older structure would not vanish entirely. They would remain embedded somewhere more durable than parchment, buried beneath soil, locked inside stone, waiting quietly beneath the surface of the earth, beneath fields like the one we left behind, beneath deserts that seem untouched and jungles that swallow everything. Entire cities sleep. They are not legends. They are measured, mapped, and slowly uncovered by careful hands. Dust is brushed from carved stone. Soil gives way to staircases, descending into shadow. Walls rise from the earth with angles so precise they seem almost recent, as though the builders have just stepped away. Sunlight touches surfaces that have not felt warmth for thousands of years. Archaeologists move carefully, kneeling beside blocks cut with deliberate symmetry. Drainage channels appear beneath streets laid out on strict grids. Foundations align with cardinal directions. In some places, complex water systems stretch beneath settlements that official timelines classify as early, experimental, still learning. There is no proclamation that these cities are impossible. That word rarely enters serious discussion. Instead, something quieter happens. A question lingers in the background. How did this level of organization appear so suddenly? In the layers below, signs of gradual development are thin. Above them, evidence of simplification often follows. The pattern unsettles only when viewed without haste. Techniques emerge fully formed, stone shaped with accuracy, infrastructure planned at scale, and then, centuries later, similar precision fades. Masonry becomes rougher. Urban layouts lose their symmetry. Knowledge that once seemed stable thins into fragments. Then, much later, complexity returns. It is tempting to frame these cycles as experimentation and correction. Early success followed by regression, then rediscovery. But standing in the quiet of an excavation trench, watching ancient streets stretch into shadow, the question feels heavier. Why do some of the oldest cities resemble continuity rather than beginning? In certain sites, abandonment appears abrupt. Tools left in place, structures unfinished, fires extinguished. But not rebuilt. There are no long periods of gradual decline in the layers immediately above. Instead, there is interruption. Other settlements were not merely deserted. They were buried, sand-filled courtyards, earth-sealed doorways. In some regions, entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath deliberate covering, as though preservation itself was an intention. Infrastructure that once sustained thousands became irrelevant. Water systems clogged, roads dissolved into obscurity. And when future communities rose nearby, they often built smaller, simpler versions atop or beside what remained, unaware of the full complexity beneath their feet. The emotional tension grows in this recognition. These cities do not feel like crude first attempts at civilization. They feel organized, intentional, sometimes even refined. If they were the beginning, why do they carry the confidence of something that already knew how to build? Imagine arriving after devastation with fragments of knowledge carried by a surviving population. You remember certain principles. You salvage techniques. You rebuild carefully. The first generation reconstructs infrastructure as best it can. The second adapts it. Over time, memory fades, and with it, mastery. What if some early urban centers were not the dawn of complexity, but the echo of a previous height? The idea is not accusation. It is not denial of mainstream interpretation. It is a shift in perspective. When we call something ancient, we assume origin. But ancient does not always mean first. It can mean preserved. As archaeologists sweep away layers of sediment, they reveal more than walls and streets. They reveal interruptions. They reveal confidence followed by quiet. They reveal moments where human organization surged forward, only to vanish and surge again. The feeling is subtle but persistent. These cities stand in the wrong century. Not because they are misplaced in time, but because their presence suggests a deeper timeline than the one we casually repeat. If settlements like these were abandoned suddenly, the force that caused it must have been overwhelming. Not gradual erosion, not slow decline, but something decisive enough to silence entire populations. To understand that force, we must look beyond architecture and into the marks left by destruction itself. Across several excavation sites, archaeologists have encountered something unsettling. Not only collapsed walls or broken pillars, but stone itself altered in ways that demand attention. Blocks once solid appear glazed, as if exposed to temperatures far beyond ordinary fire. In certain fortifications, outer layers of rock have fused together, their surfaces warped and hardened into glass, like sheen. The term used is simple, vitrification. Yet the simplicity of the word hides the magnitude of what it implies. Stone does not melt easily. Before speculation begins, natural causes must be considered. Lightning can fracture rock. Meteor impacts generate immense heat. Volcanic eruptions reshape entire landscapes. In regions near fault lines and magma flows, vitrified surfaces may not seem extraordinary at all. These explanations are grounded, measurable, familiar, but there are locations where none of these forces appear present. Hilltop settlements far from volcanic activity show signs of stones fused together, as though exposed to sudden, concentrated heat. Fortified walls display glazing not consistent with gradual burning. Archaeological layers beneath them reveal no clear traces of prolonged firewood combustion, capable of reaching such temperatures, and yet the surfaces remain altered, frozen in transformation. The cautious scholar resists dramatic conclusions. Evidence demands restraint. But restraint does not erase anomaly. In some ancient sites, destruction layers suggest intense and rapid thermal events. Structures that once stood firm appear weakened, not by erosion but by force applied in a short span. In other locations, surrounding areas show little damage, as though heat struck selectively. There are, of course, possible explanations. Defensive techniques involving deliberate high-temperature fires, accidental infernos fueled by unusual materials, even rare atmospheric phenomena. None of these are impossible. Yet when viewed collectively across distances and cultures, the pattern grows curious. Heat strong enough to reshape stone. Then silence. No detailed chronicled account describes walls melting under assault. No surviving scroll records a technology capable of generating such force in antiquity. Instead, myths speak in metaphor. Cities consumed by fire from the sky. Lands scorched by divine wrath. Towers falling in brilliance too bright to gaze upon. Metaphor, perhaps, or memory reframed. The unease lies not in proving advanced weaponry. It lies in acknowledging scale. Conventional warfare of early eras relied on blades, siege engines, firewood, and patience. It was brutal but limited. To vitrify stone requires temperatures far beyond campfires and burning arrows. What kind of force leaves scars like these, and then vanishes from record? The question lingers without accusation. It does not insist on a lost technology. It does not claim hidden machinery buried beneath sand. It only suggests that destruction may have once exceeded our assumed boundaries. Ambiguity carries its own gravity. When stone itself bears witness to extreme heat, and explanation remains partial, curiosity deepens. The human instinct is to search for alignment between physical evidence and narrative record. When alignment falters, the mind becomes restless. Some vitrified sites are isolated. Others appear tied to settlement endings. After the heat, occupation ceases. Layers above show new communities building differently, often more simply. Techniques shift. Materials change. Confidence in stone gives way to caution. This rhythm echoes what has already been sensed. Complexity interrupted, then resumed. If catastrophe occurred on such scale that even stone remembers it, survival would not be unchanged. Communities facing such force would reassess knowledge, ambition, and risk. Technologies associated with devastation might be set aside. Narratives might soften the horror into allegory. What remains most striking is not certainty, but absence. The scars exist. The explanations circle them carefully. The records do not fully account for them. Heat altered the stone. The city fell silent. And the next generation built upon cooled ruins, carrying forward what it could, perhaps choosing deliberately what it would not. If we wish to understand what knowledge survived such devastation, and what may have been set aside, we must turn from stone to memory itself, to the choices made by those who endured. Imagine the silence after destruction. Not the silence of an empty field, but the silence of survivors, counting what remains. Trade routes fractured. Familiar landmarks reduced to rubble or ash. Those who endure do not first ask how to record the event. They ask how to live through tomorrow. In such a landscape, precision becomes secondary to stability. The urgent need is not accuracy, but reassurance. Children need stories that calm them. Communities need explanations that restore order. Leaders need narratives that prevent despair from spreading further than the damage already has. Now imagine that among the fragments salvaged from the ruins were pieces of knowledge that once amplified power, techniques, principles, ambitions that may have contributed to collapse. Would every detail be preserved openly? Or would some of it be set aside, reduced, translated into something less volatile? If knowledge once nearly ended the world, would you teach it again? The question is not dramatic, it is human. Survival reshapes priorities. Entire communities recovering from trauma may instinctively simplify their worldview. Complicated systems give way to manageable structures. Technological ambition narrows into what feels safe. Precision dissolves into parable. This is where mythology enters quietly. Stories of great floods wiping away corruption. Tales of fire sent from the heavens as punishment. Legends of ages that ended because humanity overstepped invisible boundaries. These narratives appear across cultures, often describing destruction followed by renewal. They may not be literal accounts, but they may not be pure invention either. When a population lacks stable archives or widespread literacy, Memory travels through story, and stories compress events into symbols. A catastrophic war becomes a battle among gods. Environmental collapse becomes divine wrath. A technological miscalculation becomes hubris, punished by higher forces. Over time, the symbolism solidifies. The raw event fades. What remains is caution, encoded in myth. Early civilizations that emerge after large-scale destruction may appear to be discovering knowledge for the first time. Yet look closely, and some discoveries feel more like recovery. Agricultural methods refined swiftly. Astronomical patterns recognized with surprising confidence. Architectural principles implemented without a long, visible trial period. What if these societies were not inventing entirely new frameworks, but reconstructing fragments carefully preserved? In a post-catastrophe world, survivors might guard certain teachings closely. Advanced knowledge could be restricted to small circles deemed responsible enough to handle it. Calendars might reset, not because time began anew, but because reckoning from the old era felt too heavy. This is where the idea of a civilizational memory reset deepens. It does not require a secret council erasing history in one sweeping act. It can arise from shared trauma and structural necessity. Families tell gentler versions of events. Leaders endorse narratives that unify. Over generations, the simplified version becomes the accepted one. Forgetting, in this sense, is not betrayal, it is adaptation. The unsettling possibility is that our recorded history may begin not at the height of human complexity, but at the moment complexity was deliberately restrained. What we consider dawn could in fact be recovery. Imagine future archaeologists examining our era after a profound disruption. If only fragments survived, would they interpret those fragments as origin? Or would they sense layers missing beneath them? The thought lingers quietly. Perhaps the oldest cities were not the first attempts at civilization, but careful rebuilds shaped by caution. Perhaps myths are not naive explanations of nature, but softened echoes of events too immense to recount plainly. If that is so, then the story of humanity is less a straight ascent and more a series of recoveries. With this psychological possibility in place, a new question emerges. If societies reset their memory after trauma, do their timelines across continents align? Did multiple civilizations pass through synchronized thresholds of collapse and renewal? To answer that, we must widen the lens beyond a single region and examine the rhythms of the world itself. Step back from a single excavation site and the ground beneath one city. Lift your gaze higher, as if rising above continents, and the pattern begins to stretch outward. What first felt isolated now appears to echo across distance. In Mesopotamia, urban centers that once pulsed with trade and administration dimmed. In the Indus Valley, carefully planned, cities thinned and reorganized. Across Mesoamerica, monumental construction paused, then shifted. In parts of ancient China, political structures fractured before reassembling under new forms. Each event is usually explained on its own terms. A river changed course. A drought persisted too long. An invasion destabilized fragile rule. These explanations hold weight. They are grounded in evidence, shaped by careful scholarship. Yet when placed beside one another, something quiet but persistent emerges. The timing overlaps. Within overlapping centuries, complex societies across oceans experienced abrupt transitions. Not identical endings, not mirrored catastrophes, but rhythms that feel strangely aligned. Trade networks that once stretched far faltered. Monument construction slowed or ceased. Administrative systems restructured. In some places, cities were simply left behind, their plazas empty, their temples unfinished. Then, after a period of quiet, new formations arose. The landscape tells the story gently. Riverbeds reveal signs of climatic strain. Agricultural terraces, inscriptions, grow sparse. What is striking is not singular collapse, but the repetition of restructuring across cultures with no direct contact. Historians are cautious, as they must be. Each region holds its own complexity. To merge them prematurely into one narrative risks oversimplification. And yet, the question persists. Why do civilizations, separated by oceans, fall into crisis within the same centuries? Perhaps coincidence, perhaps similar environmental cycles reaching tipping points at once, or perhaps something less visible, systemic interdependence we do not fully recognize. Ancient trade may have been broader than once assumed. Goods, ideas, crops, and technologies flowed along networks, spanning continents. If those networks were more integrated than we imagine, then disruption in one region could ripple outward. A drought affecting grain supply in one area might destabilize trade routes elsewhere. A population movement in one land could cascade into political strain in another. This is how complex systems fail, not always through a single explosion, but through cascading pressure. One weakness exposing another, one disruption amplifying the next. Midway through this widening lens, the familiar explanations begin to feel incomplete. Drought here, invasion there, economic strain elsewhere, all valid. Yet what if these were not separate causes but symptoms of a broader shift? The tone remains calm. There is no claim of a single, hidden hand guiding events. Instead, there is recognition that civilizations are not isolated islands. They breathe together, often unknowingly. Picture empty plazas beneath quiet skies in different hemispheres. Unfinished monuments standing like paused sentences, river systems shrinking in lands that once flourished. Then, slowly, communities reorganize. Political systems shift, rituals adapt. Construction resumes under new ideologies. The world does not end, it reorganizes. The echo between these reorganizations invites contemplation. Perhaps what we call separate ancient collapses were chapters of one larger disruption, experienced differently in each region, but rooted in overlapping pressures. If this is so, then history is less fragmented than it appears. The continents may not have shared a single dramatic event, but they may have shared synchronized thresholds of strain. When multiple societies cross such thresholds within the same window of time, it suggests that something altered, not only their structures, but their perception of continuity. And if continuity was shaken globally, even subtly, then the very reckoning of time itself may have shifted. To understand that possibility, we must look at how civilizations measured their beginnings, and what it means when they chose to start counting anew. Time feels permanent. It moves forward without hesitation, indifferent to human memory. Yet, the way we measure time is deeply human. Calendars do not fall from the sky. They are chosen, structured, declared. They begin somewhere, and where they begin reveals what a society believes about its past. Across the ancient world, civilizations marked their years not from the emergence of humanity, but from moments of renewal. After flood, after fire, after a king reclaimed order from chaos. Sacred chronologies often opened with restoration, rather than origin. The emphasis was not on the first sunrise ever witnessed, but on the sunrise after devastation. This subtle distinction changes everything. A calendar is more than a counting device. It is a statement of worldview. When a culture proclaims a year one, it is defining a threshold. Before that threshold lies something either too distant, too fragmented, or too uncomfortable to anchor publicly. Imagine living in the aftermath of collapse. Cities quiet, trade reduced, population thinned, old institutions dissolved. In such a moment, starting over is not symbolic, it is stabilizing. Declaring a new era allows society to detach from a traumatic sequence and orient toward coherence. The past becomes divided into before and after. What if our current historical baseline begins not at the dawn of civilization, but at its reconstruction? Consider how often rulers reset chronology. A new dynasty ascends and proclaims a new era name. Years are counted from coronation rather than ancestry. Religious traditions establish sacred time anchored in revelation or renewal. Over centuries, each one narrows the lens slightly, compressing what came before into broader categories: mythic ages, lost dynasties, primordial chaos. Knowing of this requires deception. It requires practicality. Maintaining uninterrupted chronological precision across widespread catastrophe is nearly impossible. Records burn. Scribes vanish. Successor regimes consolidate power by defining new anchors. In this process, earlier timelines may be shortened or folded into symbolic epochs. 1,000 years can become a single age. Multiple transitional periods may merge into a simplified narrative arc. Not because historians intend distortion, but because reconstruction demands clarity. Imagine future generations inheriting layered resets. A calendar already adjusted by prior adjustment. A year count built atop earlier recalibration. Over long stretches, the baseline itself becomes opaque. The earliest threshold feels absolute. Even if it marks only the earliest preserved stability, the unsettling thought arises quietly. What if the year we call zero was not the beginning, but the restart? If civilizations across continents experience synchronized strain, and if their reconstructions required new origins, then their calendars may encode those resets. Renewal myths align suspiciously well with chronological thresholds. Flood narratives correspond with era changes. Fires from the heavens precede new sacred time. Calendrical resets are not unusual in history. They are common. Yet when viewed through the lens of synchronized collapse, they begin to suggest more than political rebranding. They imply rupture. Time, in this sense, becomes architectural. It frames memory. What lies before the frame fades. What lies after receives structure and record. The deeper implication is not that history is fabricated, but that it may be segmented more sharply than we assume. There may be more behind our earliest preserved chapters than we comfortably acknowledge. If timekeeping itself was reorganized after periods of widespread disruption, then fragments of knowledge tied to earlier cycles might not have been erased, but sealed within symbols and alignments rather than formal chronologies. And if such fragments survived, they may still be visible, not in manuscripts, but in stone and sky, quietly marking cycles that stretch far beyond our current reckoning. When cities crumble and libraries burn, one constant remains untouched: the sky. Night after night, the same stars return, patient and exact. Constellations rise and set with quiet precision. The sun reaches its highest and lowest points without regard for empires. Across thousands of years, celestial cycles continue, indifferent to human interruption. Ancient builders seem to understand this constancy. Across deserts and forests, pyramids, stone circles, and step temples align with remarkable care. Openings frame the solstice sunrise. Corridors trace equinox shadows. Pillars mark the slow drift of stars across the horizon. These are not casual alignments. They reveal deliberate observations stretched over generations. Civilizations separated by vast distance tracked the sky with surprising accuracy. They measured the length of the year. They charted planetary movements. Some even accounted for the gradual wobble of Earth's axis, a phenomenon known today as precession, which unfolds across thousands of years. Such knowledge cannot be gathered in a single lifetime. It requires patience, continuity, and trust that the future will inherit what the present records. Imagine standing beneath a pyramid on a cold desert night. Above you, Orion tilts in familiar rhythm. The same pattern shone over the builders who raised those stones. If all else were lost, the stars would still trace their slow arc. Here, a quiet possibility emerges. If knowledge of engineering, metallurgy, or political structure proved volatile in times of strain, perhaps astronomical knowledge was different. The sky does not wage war. It does not conquer. It offers order without ambition. Perhaps that is why celestial observation endured, even when other systems thinned. Astronomy encodes time beyond human lifespans. It anchors memory across ages. A monument aligned to a specific star does more than celebrate beauty. It fixes a moment in the long sweep of cycles. In that sense, architecture becomes a message written in stone, a timestamp resistant to erosion of paper or myth. Some alignments are especially intriguing. Certain structures appear oriented not to the sky, as it appeared at the time of their supposed construction, but to positions thousands of years earlier. The explanation is debated, often technical: measurement error, gradual modification, interpretive variation. Yet the pattern invites reflection. What if the sky holds timestamps from a civilization, older than our records admit. This question does not demand dramatic conclusions. It invites awe. Even if every alignment is fully understood within accepted chronologies, the persistence of sky-based architecture across cultures suggests shared recognition of something larger than immediate survival. When catastrophe disrupts human systems, celestial cycles continue unchanged. A community rebuilding from loss might look upward for stability. The stars offer continuity when earthly records fragment. It is possible that astronomical knowledge was preserved precisely because it posed no threat. It grounded ritual calendars, guided agriculture, stabilized belief systems. Unlike technologies tied to power or conflict, sky observation carried minimal risk. If other sciences faded while celestial alignment endured, perhaps that was not accidental. Standing beneath ancient stones, one feels a strange blend of fragility and permanence. Empires have vanished, languages have shifted, entire belief systems have transformed. Yet the same stars still rise on schedule, tracing paths that predate written memory. Civilizations may fall, the sky remains. And in that steady brilliance, one wonders whether the most durable memory of humanity is not carved in archives, but etched into alignments that quietly outlast collapse. If fragments of prior knowledge survived, protected within sacred architecture and cosmology, then someone, or some tradition, determined what was permitted to endure. To understand how that choice shaped the story we inherited, we must turn from stone and starlight toward those who guided the narrative itself. When disruption passes, it rarely leaves a vacuum for long. Into the silence, structure returns, where small communities once acted independently. Coordination slowly strengthens, where scattered beliefs once drifted uncertainly. Shared systems of ritual and law take shape. History shows this rhythm repeatedly. Chaos fractures, and from the fracture, hierarchy rises. It is not always ambition that drives this change. Often, it is fear. A population that has endured devastation does not crave complexity. It longs for certainty, clear rules, clear authority, clear explanations for what went wrong and how it will not happen again. In that environment, centralized institutions do not merely expand, they become anchors. Priesthoods consolidate ritual authority, offering cosmologies that restore coherence. Monarchies claim divine legitimacy, not only to govern land, but to stabilize belief. Administrative systems formalize law, codifying expectations and creating predictable order. Writing becomes standardized. Records become more regulated. All of this can be understood as survival. Yet beneath these developments lies another layer, quieter but equally powerful. When authority consolidates territory, it also consolidates narrative. Control over geography often includes control over memory. After widespread disruption, ambiguous accounts are destabilizing. Competing explanations breed doubt. Doubt breeds anxiety. A unified story, even if simplified, calms the collective mind. It provides direction. It anchors identity. Imagine emerging from catastrophe with fragmented recollections passed down through scattered groups. Some speak of fire, others of flood, still others of conflict beyond comprehension. If such accounts remain disorganized, social cohesion weakens. Each interpretation threatens unity. So consolidation begins. The subtle reveal here is not sinister. It is structural. What if the consolidation of early empires was not merely political, but epistemological? What if emerging authorities recognized that to govern effectively, they needed not only borders and armies, but coherence of origin? Narrative becomes statecraft. A streamlined cosmology replaces diffuse memory. A singular lineage replaces overlapping genealogies. An official calendar supersedes multiple reckonings. The past is arranged into chapters that support stability. Contradictions are minimized. Complexity narrows. In this process, something profound may occur. Fragmented memories from earlier cycles, already compressed by trauma, become further integrated into a structured account that serves governance. The resulting history feels continuous and authoritative. Over time, it becomes unquestioned. This does not require deception. It requires prioritization. Which texts are copied, which traditions are endorsed, which explanations are taught to the next generation. Institutions tasked with order naturally prefer clarity over ambiguity. They preserve what aligns with cohesion. They reshape what destabilizes it. Across civilizations, this pattern appears again. After periods of disorder, strong centralized systems rise. Law codes emerge. Religious narratives become codified. Administrative scribes regulate archives. The architecture of power intertwines with the architecture of memory. The viewer begins to sense that something significant has formed, not a grand conspiracy, but an ecosystem in which narrative simplification becomes protective. If collective memory had already thinned through trauma, and centralized authority then formalized what remained, the resulting record would appear solid. Yet beneath that solidity, layers of compression might persist. After the world fractures, who writes the story that holds it together? The answer is rarely a hidden council in shadow. It is often those tasked with restoring order. Leaders, priests, scholars, administrators, acting within the logic of survival. As the structure of authority strengthens, another question emerges naturally. If narrative is shaped through institutions, then the tools through which memory is stored and transmitted become crucial. To understand what survived and what did not, we must examine the libraries, scriptoria, and archives that carried the newly structured story forward. Civilization rests not only on stone and soil, but on memory carefully carried forward. Scroll by scroll, tablet by tablet, voice by voice. A library is not simply a building filled with texts. It is a wager against forgetting. And yet libraries are fragile. History survives because someone decides it must. Across ages, archives have burned. Sometimes through invasion, sometimes through accident, sometimes through quiet neglect. Fire does not distinguish between trivial record and profound insight. When shelves collapse into ash, centuries can vanish in a single night. But flames are not the only threat. In scriptoria and monasteries, scribes once labored for hours copying manuscripts by hand. Each duplication required ink, parchment, patience, and intent. A single generation's decision about which texts deserved repetition determined what endured. What was not copied slowly faded. Materials decayed. Languages shifted. Ideas dissolved, not because they were attacked, but because they were not renewed. Oral traditions faced similar vulnerability. Stories passed from elder to child carried nuance, only as long as memory remained vivid. When communities fractured or elders were lost, entire strands of history could unravel within decades. This is the quiet arithmetic of preservation. Survival does not demand erasure. It requires selection. What if the greatest loss was not knowledge destroyed, but knowledge never rewritten after catastrophe? After upheaval, resources are scarce. Time is limited. Stability takes priority. When rebuilding begins, practical knowledge dominates attention. Agriculture, law, ritual, governance. Technical treatises that feel dangerous or destabilizing may not receive careful copying. Complex accounts of prior turmoil may be softened into symbol. Intricate chronologies may compress into simplified lineage lists. Not because someone ordered deletion, but because someone had to choose. Imagine a scribe sitting in the dim light of a Reconstruction era, deciding which fragile manuscripts to preserve. Does he copy the detailed account of a technological experiment that preceded disaster? Or the moralized version that warns future generations through allegory? Does he maintain a long and fragmented timeline? Or condense it into eras more easily understood? The emotional tone of this process is not villainy. It is melancholy. There is weight in deciding what survives you. Over centuries, selective continuity shapes the record. Technical sciences may fragment into guarded disciplines. Mythic frameworks become dominant because they are memorable and stable. Detailed explanations shrink into poetic narratives, more suited to communal cohesion. In this way, erasure does not require a coordinated conspiracy. It requires only the natural filtering of survival. Each generation passes forward what it deems essential. What falls outside that frame grows faint. When modern readers encounter ancient texts, we often assume they represent the fullness of a civilization's knowledge. Yet what we hold may be a curated remainder, resilient, meaningful, but incomplete. How much of the past disappeared not in flames, but in choices about what was worth preserving? This question carries no accusation. It carries humility. Our own era makes similar decisions daily. Digital files are archived or abandoned. Research is funded or dismissed. Educational curricula emphasize certain narratives and overlook others. If selective preservation shaped early history, the consequence would not only be lost books, it would be compression. Long, complicated sequences merged into accessible epochs, overlapping cultures, streamlined into linear progression, gaps sealed through simplification. And once compression begins, it can transform centuries into summaries, erasing nuance in favor of coherence. To understand whether this occurred in deeper antiquity, we must examine how time itself may have been shortened, merged, or reinterpreted as new authorities solidified their grasp on memory. When records fracture, continuity becomes a delicate craft. Historians do not simply discover the past, they assemble it. Fragments are compared, inscriptions aligned, layers dated and cross-referenced. Where documentation flows smoothly, the task feels stable. Where it breaks, reconstruction begins. This reconstruction is careful, disciplined, often brilliant. Yet it rests on inference. Long spans of time can contract when clarity fades. Dynasties that once overlapped may be placed sequentially for coherence. Cultural transitions that unfolded gradually may be described as sudden shifts. Oral traditions, once expansive and layered, shrink when finally written down, compressed into streamlined genealogies and defined epochs. This process is not deception, it is adaptation. Human minds crave order. When confronted with incomplete evidence, we bridge gaps with the most plausible connections available. Consider a period where inscriptions grow scarce. Archaeological layers provide clues, but not detailed narration. Scholars construct timelines through comparison, pottery styles, carbon dating, shifts in material culture. These tools are powerful, yet they rarely yield precision measured in exact years. They offer ranges, probabilities, approximations. Over time, approximations settle into accepted sequence. What began as estimation becomes standard chronology. The scaffold that once held uncertainty quietly solidifies. What if parts of our ancient timeline are not recorded, but reconstructed? This question does not accuse historians of fabrication. It acknowledges limitation. When continuity breaks, filling the gap requires interpretation, and interpretation, however cautious, shapes perception. Entire centuries can narrow when evidence is sparse. Complex regional interactions may be simplified into clean transitions. The result is a narrative that flows convincingly from one era to the next, yet beneath that flow, the texture may be uneven. In some cases, durations attributed to ancient periods rely on assumptions about lineage lengths or standardized reigns. Oral traditions, once stretching deep into the past, may have been codified later, losing nuance in the process. Myths, layered across generations, can collapse into singular legendary epochs. Compression can occur without anyone intending it. It arises naturally when the available record favors clarity over complication. The implication is subtle, but profound. What we call ancient history may stand upon a framework more delicate than it appears. Not fragile in terms of evidence, but scaffolded where gaps once existed. If earlier disruptions thinned the archive, and later authorities organized what remained into coherent structure, compression would be inevitable. This does not render the past fictional. Every civilization inherits a story about its origins. That inheritance shapes identity, education, and worldview. Yet inheritance does not guarantee completeness. It guarantees continuity of what survived. The question grows quieter and heavier at once. If narrative control shaped the first reset through selective preservation, structured calendars, and centralized authority, could something similar unfold again, under different condition? not necessarily through fire or conquest. Perhaps through fragmentation of digital memory, perhaps through oversimplification in the name of accessibility, perhaps through the quiet narrowing of complex debates into tidy timelines. The chapter closes not with suspicion, but with awareness. History is a living reconstruction, guided by evidence and shaped by human need for coherence. The deeper we look, the more we recognize both its strength and its vulnerability. If parts of our ancient timeline are reconstructed, rather than fully recorded, then rediscovered anomalies in the modern age may test the stability of that framework. And as we move forward into an era of powerful technology and renewed excavation, the question shifts from what was compressed long ago to what is being uncovered now, and whether those discoveries will gently adjust the story we thought was settled. The modern world orbits the planet in silence. Satellites glide above cloud lines, mapping terrain in wavelengths invisible to the human eye. Below them, deserts stretch and jungles breathe, their surfaces hiding layers of history, long assumed lost. For centuries, excavation depended on shovels, patience, and intuition. Now, the ground itself can be scanned before a single stone is lifted. Ground-penetrating radar pulses into soil and returns with faint echoes of buried walls. LiDAR sweeps across dense forest canopies, stripping away foliage digitally to reveal geometric outlines beneath. What once appeared as untouched wilderness suddenly displays grids, platforms, causeways extending for miles. Artificial intelligence compares fragments across databases, recognizing patterns too subtle for unaided sight. Entire urban networks emerge where textbooks once described scattered settlements. Cities previously thought isolated reveal roads, linking them to distant centers. Terraces carved into hillsides suggest agricultural planning at scales far beyond prior estimates. Water systems traced beneath sediment show deliberate engineering in regions labeled early or transitional. There is no rush to declare revolutions in understanding. Scholars proceed carefully, verifying findings, adjusting models methodically. Yet a quiet shift unfolds. Complexity begins appearing earlier than anticipated. Organization seems more extensive. Human coordination stretches further back. The sensation is familiar. Again and again, technology uncovers what appears advanced for its assigned era. Structured road systems in jungles, long dismissed as marginal. Monumental earthworks hidden beneath farmland. Settlements dated to periods previously categorized as sparse or unstable. These discoveries do not overthrow established chronology. They refine it. They stretch it gently. They reveal density where emptiness was presumed. What happens when technology begins uncovering a past more advanced than we were prepared to find? The question is not one of conspiracy. It is one of scale. Our image of ancient humanity often oscillates between ingenuity and limitation. But with each scan, each satellite sweep, each digital reconstruction, the picture becomes more intricate. In some regions, entire civilizations surface from beneath canopy, their populations estimated in numbers previously deemed improbable. In others, defensive structures appear older than assumed conflict periods. The data does not insist on forgotten superpowers. It insists on nuance. Academic frameworks adapt slowly but steadily. Interpretations are debated. Models are revised. This is how knowledge grows. Yet the pattern feels strikingly consistent with earlier themes, complexity predating expectation. The tools are new. The surprise is ancient. Standing at the edge of this technological threshold, one begins to sense the layers beneath layers. What we see on the surface may be only the most recent expression of much deeper organization. And if modern instruments are only now revealing settlements invisible for centuries, how many more remain concealed beyond our current reach? The Earth does not surrender its history easily. It requires light, frequency, computation. Even then, the image returned is partial. Outlines without context, structures without voice. Machines can expose stone. They can map grids beneath foliage. They can estimate scale with astonishing precision. But they cannot retrieve the thoughts, the fears, the intentions of those who built. We may uncover roads and reservoirs, but memory itself remains elusive. With each new discovery, the boundaries of accepted narrative shift slightly. Institutions respond with caution, as they must. Evidence must be weighed, corroborated, placed within broader context. Yet, as the ground yields complexity, once hidden, a subtle tension builds. If technology continues to expand our understanding beyond prior expectation, how will established systems absorb these revelations? The next question is no longer about what lies buried. It is about how living institutions respond when the past grows larger than they once believed. Knowledge does not exist in isolation. It lives within frameworks. Archaeology, history, astronomy. Each discipline rests upon models carefully assembled over decades, sometimes centuries. These models offer coherence. They allow scholars to teach, compare, categorize. Without structure, information dissolves into noise. When new discoveries appear, they do not instantly overturn those structures. They are tested, questioned, measured against existing interpretation. This is not stubbornness. It is discipline. A single anomaly does not rewrite a chronology. It enters the system slowly, waiting to see if it holds under scrutiny. And yet, there is another layer to this process. Careers are built within paradigms. Research funding supports certain lines of inquiry. Textbooks reflect agreed timelines. Academic departments evolve around shared assumptions. When evidence hints that the established sequence may be incomplete, integration is rarely immediate. When new LiDAR scans reveal cities older and denser than expected, scholars respond cautiously. Additional dating methods are applied. Independent teams verify data. Conferences host debates. Papers circulate through peer review. This is how rigor protects credibility. But what if some discoveries that hint at earlier complexity are not suppressed deliberately, but slowed by the natural inertia of institutional stability? The idea requires no hidden counsel. It requires only the recognition that institutions value continuity. A model revised too quickly risks instability in teaching and research. Adjustments occur in increments, not revolutions. The tension lies here. Caution preserves accuracy. Yet excessive caution can delay adaptation. Narratives shaped decades ago may linger longer than evidence warrants. Not because they are defended blindly, but because rewriting foundational timelines demands consensus. Consider how often new discoveries are framed as extensions rather than disruptions. A site once dated to a certain century is reassigned to an earlier period. But the broader framework remains intact. Complexity is acknowledged, yet the overall arc shifts only slightly. This process mirrors the ancient patterns already explored. Reconstruction favors coherence. Uncertainty is gradually smooth. The viewer is invited to see this not as confrontation, but as sociology. Authority filters information through established channels. Even when intentions are honorable, systemic caution can function as a gatekeeper. When new evidence challenges the foundations of history, does truth move quickly or carefully? Most often, it moves carefully. There is comfort in stability. Educational systems rely on predictable narratives. Public understanding rests on simplified timelines. If complexity expands too rapidly, confusion follows. Institutions respond by absorbing anomalies slowly, rephrasing them within accepted bounds. Yet the world beneath our feet continues to offer surprises. Satellites do not consult textbooks before scanning forests. Radiocarbon results do not adjust themselves to fit comfortable models. Data accumulates quietly, pressing against established boundaries. Over time, pressure builds. The contemplative mood here avoids accusation. Institutions are not adversaries of truth. They are custodians of continuity, yet continuity itself can mask gradual shifts. The deeper question becomes less about resistance and more about encoding. If ancient memory was compressed through institutional structure, how much of that compression persists subtly within modern frameworks? How much do our own systems, even unintentionally, shape what we are prepared to see? The boundaries of accepted chronology expand slowly. Beneath them, new patterns form. And as the present grapples with its own inertia, the past may already be whispering through our tools, waiting to be recognized not as anomaly, but as part of a larger design. The ancient world was never as isolated as once imagined. Trade networks stretched across deserts and seas, carrying grain, metals, textiles, and ideas. A drought in one region could ripple outward through commerce. A political fracture in one kingdom could interrupt supply lines hundreds of miles away. Interconnection amplified prosperity and vulnerability. The modern world is woven even tighter. Fiber, optic cables, rest beneath oceans. Satellites bridge continents in milliseconds. Financial systems interlock across time zones. Energy grids pulse through vast regions, interdependent and continuous. Where caravans once moved slowly along dusty routes, data now travels at light speed. The scale has changed. The principle has not. Ancient civilizations relied on ecological balance, fertile river systems, predictable seasonal rains, stable climate windows. When those balances shifted, consequences cascaded. Today, society depends on intricate technological ecosystems, power generation, supply chains, communication networks, digital archives, all synchronized, all layered. The narrator does not predict catastrophe. There is no countdown ticking in the background. Instead, the focus rests on structure. Complexity enables remarkable achievement. It also creates sensitivity. The pattern observed in the past begins to feel familiar in the present. Expansion leads to integration. Integration increases efficiency. Efficiency reduces redundancy, and reduced redundancy amplifies fragility. What if civilizational resets are not anomalies, but recurring phases in long human cycles? The question arrives softly, not as threat, but as reflection. History, when viewed over millennia, rarely resembles a straight ascent. It resembles oscillation. Periods of flourishing give way to contraction. Knowledge expands, then compresses. Systems grow intricate, then simplify under strain. The arc is not tragic, it is rhythmic. Ancient collapse phases may have involved environmental shifts, resource stress, internal conflict, or cascading disruption across interconnected networks. Modern society faces its own forms of strain, climate variability, digital dependence, global synchronization that magnifies local shocks. The similarities are structural, not identical. Where ancient cities relied on river floods, modern economies rely on energy flows. Where early empires depended on grain shipments, contemporary societies depend on data transmission and supply logistics. The mediums differ, but the reliance remains. The tone remains steady, almost meditative. There is no warning siren, no dramatic forecast, only pattern recognition. If the past demonstrates that complexity carries inherent vulnerability, then the present exists within that same logic. The more interconnected a civilization becomes, the more it must manage cascading risk. Synchronization strengthens coordination, but also synchronizes failure. In ancient times, disruptions may have been experienced regionally, yet aligned globally through environmental cycles. Today, disruption can spread instantly across digital systems. The speed is unprecedented. The underlying dynamic is not. Standing in this awareness, one begins to sense continuity rather than separation. The documentary has moved from buried cities and melted stone to satellites and servers, but the theme remains constant. Systems rise, systems strain, systems reorganize. If civilizations rise in cycles, where are we standing now? Ascent, peak, or prelude? It invites humility. Humanity has navigated disruption before. Reconstruction has followed collapse repeatedly. Knowledge has thinned and thickened across eras. Perhaps what feels unprecedented is scale, not pattern. The recognition that we inhabit a deeply interconnected system does not condemn us to failure. It grants us perspective. It reveals that resilience depends not only on growth, but on memory. And memory, as we have seen, is vulnerable in ways both dramatic and subtle. As the lens turns inward once more, the next exploration moves beyond architecture and infrastructure. It moves into the nature of recollection itself, how societies remember, how they forget, and how a reset can occur without anyone consciously erasing a single word. Until now, we have traced collapse through stone, sky, and institutions. Yet the most delicate archive is neither temple nor library. It is the human mind. Memory feels durable when it belongs to us. We recall childhood homes, personal losses. Sequences blur. Painful moments lose detail, sometimes mercifully. What happens when this process unfolds not within a single person, but across an entire civilization? Psychologists describe memory as reconstructive, rather than photographic. We do not replay the past, we rebuild it from fragments, each time we remember. Communities behave in similar ways. Events are discussed, interpreted, retold. Over years, collective memory condenses. What once contained complexity becomes distilled into emblematic stories. Trauma accelerates this compression. When individuals endure distress, the mind often shields itself. Details fade, emotional weight transforms into narrative explanation. Societies do something comparable. After war or disaster, populations generate meaning to stabilize themselves. Rituals emerge. Myths take shape. Commemorations highlight resilience rather than raw horror. This is not deception. It is adaptation. Imagine trauma on civilizational scale. Infrastructure shattered. Loss widespread. Fear embedded deeply into collective experience. In such an environment, transmitting every precise detail of catastrophe to future generations may not serve survival. Instead, the essence is carried forward in symbolic form. A flood becomes a lesson about humility. A period of chaos becomes a cautionary tale about moral decline. An overwhelming conflict becomes a battle among gods. Over generations, nuance continues to thin. The original event, once immediate and visceral, settles into archetype. Characters replace individuals. Moral framing replaces technical explanation. What began as lived memory becomes mythic structure. What if humanity's greatest forgetting was not enforced, but inherited through generations seeking relief? The possibility reframes everything. A reset need not originate in secret councils or deliberate censorship. It can arise quietly through the mechanics of healing. Each generation inherits a version of events shaped by the emotional needs of those who came before. Traumatic detail becomes softened metaphor. Complexity collapses into digestible narrative. Time amplifies this transformation. As centuries pass, literal memory dissolves. What remains are echoes, motifs repeated across cultures, warnings encoded in story, rituals commemorating renewal without explicit reference to the original rupture. The flood narrative persists long after the hydrological specifics have vanished. Fire from the sky remains symbolic long after the cause is forgotten. This intimate view alters the tone of the investigation. Forgetting becomes less sinister, more human. It highlights vulnerability rather than concealment. Communities under strain do what they must to endure. They reshape memory in ways that protect continuity. In this light, civilizational reset does not demand a villain. It requires only time, trauma, and instinct. Institutions may formalize narratives, but the initial compression often begins within families and communities seeking meaning. The contemplative weight deepens. What if the greatest secrets of history faded not through censorship, but through healing? What if entire chapters of complexity softened into allegory, because literal transmission felt unbearable? As we consider this possibility, the investigation shifts subtly again. If forgetting can emerge naturally from collective psychology, the next question becomes more intricate. Can memory also be structured intentionally, not to hide the past, but to guide stability? The human mind forgets to survive, but societies also design narratives with purpose. To understand how both forces intertwine, we must examine where healing instinct meets deliberate structure, and how together they shape the continuity we inherit. When communities fracture, stories gather them back together. After crisis, people do not simply rebuild homes and roads. They rebuild meaning. A society emerging from instability seeks a shared explanation that feels solid enough to stand on. In that search, origin myths take on renewed importance. They are not childish fantasies. They are frameworks of belonging. Founding narratives unify scattered groups. They offer a clear beginning. They transform chaos into a sequence with direction. Across cultures, the pattern repeats. There was disorder, then salvation, then order restored. The structure is simple, because simplicity calms. Imagine a population recovering from wide disruption. Competing memories circulate. Some recall complexity and ambition, others recall excess and danger. If those memories remain fragmented, they risk dividing people further. A cohesive origin story provides common ground. It binds regions, tribes, or factions into a single identity. This does not require deceit. It requires intention. What if a unified origin story following global catastrophe was necessary to prevent fragmentation, even if that meant compressing earlier epochs? The idea introduces an ethical tension. On one hand, preserving the fullness of historical nuance honors truth. On the other, stabilizing a fragile society may demand clarity over complication. A simplified cosmology can prevent renewed fear. It can discourage rivalry. It can focus energy on survival, rather than endless debate about what came before. Throughout history, new regimes have framed their rise as restoration. Sacred texts are codified. Genealogies are aligned with chosen ancestors. The past is arranged into a narrative arc that supports continuity. Overlapping traditions are woven into a single lineage. Contradictions soften. Sometimes this narrowing protects cohesion. After turmoil, ambiguity can feel like instability. A shared storyline reduces anxiety. It signals that the future will not mirror the chaos just endured. The distinction between manipulation and stabilization becomes subtle here. Manipulation seeks control for advantage. Stabilization seeks order for survival. In real societies, these motives can overlap, yet they are not identical. If leaders believe that recounting the full scope of prior collapse, with all its technological detail, political conflict, or catastrophic failure, would reignite division or panic, would they choose transparency at any cost? Or would they guide memory toward a shape that felt sustainable? If telling the full truth risks instability, would leaders choose clarity or cohesion? The question resists easy judgment. Every society makes similar choices in smaller ways. Educational systems simplify history for comprehension. Cultural rituals highlight resilience over despair. Even families soften certain stories to protect younger generations. Over centuries, such choices layer upon one another. A trauma condensed into myth. A fragmented timeline reorganized into a sequence. An ambiguous memory solidified into doctrine. The result is not a lie. It is a stabilized narrative. By this point, the concept of civilizational memory reset has shifted. It is no longer a single dramatic act. It is layered. Psychological healing compresses events. Institutional authority formalizes simplifications. Structural necessity. Together, these processes can reshape the inherited past without anyone consciously declaring erasure. The tone remains reflective rather than accusatory, because the mechanism is human. Societies design stories to endure. As this understanding settles, one final and unsettling thought begins to form. If resets can unfold gradually through healing and narrative design, if they require no singular conspiracy, but only time and adaptation, then the possibility becomes present, not distant. Could another reset already be forming around us, shaped not by fire or invasion, but by quieter forces? The present feels immune to forgetting. Servers hum in climate-controlled rooms. Clouds of data orbit, unseen. Every message, photograph, transaction, and broadcast appears preserved somewhere, duplicated across continents. Never before has a civilization recorded so much about itself. The archive seems endless, and yet the experience of memory feels thinner. Information streams past in relentless succession. Headlines flare, fade, and vanish into timelines replaced by new urgency. Events that once would have marked generations now compress into days of attention, before being displaced by the next cycle. Yesterday's crisis becomes today's background noise, scrollable and distant. More data does not guarantee deeper memory. Algorithms curate what we see. They prioritize novelty, engagement, immediacy. They surface fragments optimized for speed rather than context. A complex event becomes a headline, A headline becomes a reaction becomes a trend. Then it dissolves into the digital current. The structure is efficient, but it reshapes perception. The archive expands while comprehension narrows. In earlier eras, compression occurred through trauma and reconstruction. Today, compression can occur through saturation. When everything is recorded, discernment becomes difficult. When timelines overflow, attention becomes the scarce resource. What if future generations view our era not through preserved depth, but through compressed digital residue? Imagine a distant successor uncovering fragments of our civilization through surviving servers or partial data caches. Without context, what would they see? Short-form commentary, isolated clips, endless cycles of outrage and distraction. Would the nuance of debates, the layers of research, the slow refinement of thought remain accessible? Or would only scattered remnants survive, divorced from the complexity that once framed them? A reset need not arrive with fire. It can unfold gradually through oversaturation. When digital storage systems decay or become inaccessible, vast quantities of data could vanish quietly. File formats become obsolete, servers decommissioned, encryption forgotten. What remains may be what was printed, etched, or redundantly preserved in durable forms. We often assume permanence because deletion feels deliberate, yet neglect erases just as effectively. If infrastructure falters through climate strain, economic fracture, or simple technological evolution, the continuity of digital archives becomes uncertain. The unsettling aspect lies not in imminent catastrophe, but in fragility disguised as abundance. We record everything, yet we skim constantly. We preserve endlessly, yet we revisit rarely. The paradox deepens. The most documented era in human history may be remembered in fragments. In an age that records everything, are we accidentally preparing to remember less? The question carries no alarm. It invites reflection. Memory has always depended on selection. In prior eras, scarcity forced careful copying. Today, excess forces rapid filtering. Both dynamics compress. Civilizations cycle through expansion and contraction. Knowledge thickens, then thins. Narratives stretch, then simplify. These shifts rarely announce themselves. They form quietly, shaped by structural pressures. As this chapter closes, the tension is subtle. Perhaps the next reset, if it comes, will not resemble the dramatic collapses of antiquity. It may emerge through fragmentation, through narrowing attention, through the quiet loss of digital continuity. The pattern continues not with spectacle, but with rhythm. Memory remains fragile. Systems remain interconnected. Complexity continues to grow. And somewhere within that growth, the seed of simplification always waits, not as a threat, but as part of the long cycle that has carried humanity forward before. Beyond this point, the question deepens further. If resets have appeared repeatedly across ages, and if forgetting can serve both survival and renewal, might there be a larger pattern at work? One woven into evolution itself. Step back far enough, and individual collapses begin to blur into a wider pattern. Empires rise with confidence, expand their influence, refine their institutions. Cities swell, trade routes multiply, art and science flourish. For a time, the momentum feels unstoppable. Then strain appears. Resources tighten. Political tensions sharpen. Environmental pressures intensify. Networks, once efficient, grow fragile under their own weight. The systems that enabled growth begin demanding maintenance at scales difficult to sustain. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, contraction begins. The story of human civilization over thousands of years resembles this rhythm. Expansion, peak complexity, strain, contraction, recovery. Ancient empires flourished with architecture, law, astronomy, administration. Then they fragmented into smaller successor states. Those states adapted, simplified, restructured. Generations later, the pattern repeats across continents. It is tempting to frame collapse as failure, as error, as catastrophe that should have been avoided. Yet when observed over longer spans of time, contraction does not always signal termination. It often precedes renewal. Complexity carries power, but it also carries vulnerability. The more interwoven a system becomes, the more sensitive it is to disruption. Fragility grows quietly within sophistication. A single stressor, once manageable, can cascade through interconnected layers. Disruption reduces scale. Networks shrink. Institutions dissolve. In the aftermath, smaller structures emerge, often leaner and more adaptable. From these foundations, growth begins again. What if civilizational reset is not an accident, but a recurring adaptation cycle? The question shifts the emotional tone. Collapse becomes less an aberration and more an oscillation. The arc resembles breath. Inhale, expansion, integration, flourishing, exhale, contraction, simplification, recalibration. This rhythm appears not only in politics or economics, but in ecological systems. Forests grow dense, accumulate fuel, then burn and regenerate. Species rise to dominance, then decline as environments shift. Coral reefs flourish, bleach, recover. Nature cycles through expansion and renewal without assigning moral judgment. Perhaps humanity operates within similar structural rhythms, not because collapse is desirable, but because complexity inevitably generates tension. When tension exceeds resilience, systems contract. When contraction stabilizes, expansion resumes. The contemplative mood here reframes the past. Ancient resets, whether driven by environment, conflict, or internal strain, may represent phases within a long evolutionary cadence, rather than isolated disasters. This perspective does not diminish suffering. Human lives are deeply affected during contraction phases. Cultures fade. Knowledge thins. Yet over extended timelines, contraction often seeds transformation. New ideas arise in smaller contexts. Technologies adapt. Belief systems reorganize. Seen from this altitude, civilization resembles a living organism adjusting to stress. The thought carries both humility and resilience. If resets are structural rather than random, humanity may not be uniquely flawed. It may be participating in a broader dynamic. The question widens subtly. Is this rhythm confined to human systems alone? Or is it part of a larger web? Ecological, planetary, perhaps even astronomical. If forests regenerate after fire and ecosystems rebalance after disruption, perhaps civilizational oscillation mirrors deeper biological processes. Growth and contraction appear everywhere in nature. Stability emerges not from permanence, but from adaptability. Is humanity subject to the same evolutionary rhythm? The inquiry deepens. If resets follow structural pattern, then the next exploration cannot remain purely historical. It must look outward, beyond soil and archives, beyond institutions and memory, toward forces that shape climate, environment, and perhaps even consciousness itself. If the rhythm is real, what influences its tempo? Lift your eyes beyond cities and continents, and the rhythm widens. The sky turns slowly, patiently, carrying cycles far longer than any empire. The Earth tilts and wobbles in its orbit, a subtle motion known as precession, completing its arc over thousands of years. The sun breathes through fluctuations in activity. Magnetic fields shift. Climate responds in gradual waves that can stretch across centuries. Ancient civilizations did not possess modern instruments, yet they watched the heavens with remarkable discipline. They tracked solstices and equinoxes. They marked planetary patterns. They built monuments aligned with rising stars, whose positions shifted almost imperceptibly from one generation to the next. Their calendars were not random. They were anchored to the long dance of celestial bodies. If environmental shifts driven by cosmic cycles influenced ancient collapse phases, perhaps civilizational resets were not purely political or technological. Perhaps they were synchronized, in part, with rhythms written into the sky. This possibility does not rely on fantasy. It requires only recognition of interconnected systems. Solar storms can disturb magnetic shields. Prolonged shifts in solar output can influence climate variability. Cyclical drought patterns can destabilize agricultural foundations. None of these forces are dramatic enough to resemble mythic battles in isolation. But layered together, they can strain civilizations already stretched thin. What if humanity's forgotten war was not only human, not alien invasion or science fiction, but environmental destabilization, amplified by fragile networks. A series of poor harvests tied to climatic oscillation. Trade routes stressed by shifting weather. Political tension heightened by resource scarcity, combined with ambition and conflict. Such pressures can magnify one another. The sky, indifferent to human planning, continues its motion regardless of preparation. The narrative here remains measured. It does not claim that every collapse was triggered by cosmic forces. It does not reduce complex historical dynamics to solar flares or orbital shifts. Instead, it invites a broader perspective that human systems exist within environmental frameworks shaped partly by celestial mechanics. Ancient societies understood this to varying degrees. Their attention to solstice alignments and planetary cycles suggests awareness of repeating patterns. If they recognize that certain periods brought instability, drought, unusual storms, magnetic anomalies, their myths of destruction and renewal may have encoded those observations symbolically. A flood story could represent generational memory of rapid climatic change. Fire from the sky could reflect atmospheric disturbance, witnessed repeatedly over centuries. Cyclical ages of darkness and light might correspond to long solar rhythms beyond ordinary lifespan. What if the stars were tracking our resets long before we recorded them? This question carries awe rather than accusation. The sky serves as both clock and archive. It preserves sequence in its own language. Civilizations may fall, but the precessional cycle continues. Empires fragment, yet planetary motion persists. The unsettling harmony lies in this indifference. The cosmos does not adjust its timing to human achievement when environmental oscillations converge with social fragility. The result can resemble catastrophe, even without singular dramatic cause. Over thousands of years, human societies have risen during stable climatic windows and strained during transitional phases. This pattern may not be precise or universal, but it suggests correlation rather than coincidence. If resets align partly with cosmic rhythm, survival may depend less on preventing change and more on anticipating it. Preparation becomes adaptation rather than domination. The sky moves in cycles longer than memory. It writes no judgment, only continuity. And if humanity is woven into those cycles, then the question shifts once more. Not how to escape the rhythm, but how to endure within it. Not how to halt oscillation, but how to design resilience when contraction comes. In that light, forgetting itself may not be mere loss. It may be recalibration, an adaptive narrowing before expansion resumes. The next step is to explore whether this narrowing, this periodic simplification of complexity, could itself serve a deeper evolutionary purpose. We tend to treat forgetting as failure. Lost records, vanished languages, collapsed institutions. These feel like diminishment. Yet what if forgetting, under certain conditions, serves another function? What if it is not simply erosion, but adjustment? Memory preserves wisdom. It carries techniques, lessons, and identity across generations. Without it, progress would dissolve. But memory also carries trauma. It stores fear, humiliation, regret, and caution. When accumulated beyond processing, these impressions can weigh heavily on collective decision-making. Consider individuals who endure profound distress. The mind often narrows focus afterward. Certain details fade. The memory does not disappear entirely, but it becomes more symbolic, more manageable. Healing sometimes requires distance from raw precision. Societies may operate similarly. After large-scale disruption, the sheer volume of accumulated complexity can feel overwhelming. Intricate trade systems, layered governance, expansive technological ambition, all of these demand stability to function. When stability fractures, simplicity becomes refuge. What if civilizational memory resets protect humanity from becoming trapped in its own accumulated trauma? The idea is unsettling, yet it reframes collapse. Rather than perceiving reset solely as loss, we might see it as contraction that restores resilience. By shedding certain structures and narrowing narrative scope, societies reduce vulnerability. The burden of maintaining intricate systems eases. Energy shifts towards survival. rather than preservation of sprawling complexity. This does not glorify amnesia. Forgetting carries cost. Knowledge lost can take generations to rediscover. Yet, in evolutionary terms, adaptation often involves pruning. Species adjust not only by adding traits, but by discarding those that no longer serve resilience under new conditions. Ancient collapses may have forced humanity into such pruning. Technologies once central could have been deemed too risky or resource-intensive. Social hierarchies may have flattened temporarily. Belief systems could have simplified into archetypes that strengthened cohesion rather than debate. In this sense, forgetting becomes selective. It is not total erasure, but recalibration. Critical skills endure. Cultural identity persists, but layers of intricacy thin, making societies lighter and more adaptable. The paradox remains sharp. Memory ensures continuity, yet too much unresolved memory can anchor communities in fear. Excessive weight from prior collapse can paralyze innovation if every mistake is remembered in painful detail. Ambition may stagnate. Could forgetting be the mechanism that allows civilization to survive itself? The question lingers between caution and possibility. It does not imply that all loss is beneficial. It suggests that oscillation between expansion and simplification may reflect deeper evolutionary logic. Complexity grows until strain emerges. Contraction follows, stripping systems to essentials. From essentials, renewal begins. The contemplative tone remains steady. There is no triumph in collapse, no romanticizing of hardship. There is only recognition that life, whether ecological or cultural, operates through cycles of accumulation and reduction. This reflection returns the inquiry to the present. Modern society is layered with unprecedented complexity. Digital infrastructure, global finance, intricate supply chains, vast knowledge networks. Each layer offers power. Each layer introduces fragility. If resets are cyclical and adaptive, are we currently building a structure too brittle to endure the next contraction? The question does not forecast imminent breakdown. It highlights structural awareness. Evolution favors resilience, not merely expansion. As this chapter closes, attention turns toward those who might already sense these rhythms. If cycles persist, and if forgetting can function as adaptation, perhaps some institutions quietly prepare for contraction, even while the world expands. The next exploration asks not whether resets occur, but who in the present recognizes the pattern and how they might be planning within it. Most of the world moves in short increments. Election cycles, quarterly earnings, daily headlines. The present feels urgent and immediate. Yet beyond the noise, there are institutions whose timelines stretch far further than a season or a term. In quiet offices and observatories, researchers track asteroids, whose orbits span centuries. Space agencies monitor solar behavior, studying cycles that outlast entire political administrations. Climate scientists model patterns unfolding across decades, even centuries, tracing subtle shifts in temperature, ocean currents, and atmospheric chemistry. Ecological research centers study resilience, not in years, but in generations. Universities, in their most ideal form, exist to transmit knowledge across time. Archival foundations preserve documents with the expectation that someone, long after current debates have faded, will need access to them. Seed vaults store biodiversity against uncertainties that may not arrive in our lifetimes. These efforts rarely dominate headlines. They are methodical, technical, deliberate, yet they reveal something profound about human awareness. Some disciplines operate with quiet recognition of vulnerability. They understand that systems are not guaranteed to remain stable indefinitely. They examine long-duration risks with patience rather than urgency. Impact probabilities are calculated. Solar cycles are charted. Data redundancy is engineered into storage system. There is no dramatic council declaring impending reset. There is no singular institution planning for civilizational collapse in theatrical secrecy. Instead, there is distributed foresight. What if awareness of cyclical vulnerability already shapes long-term planning, but without public framing in terms of reset? The language used is practical, risk mitigation, resilience, sustainability. Preparation does not require apocalyptic expectation. It requires recognition that fragility exists, that climate fluctuates, that solar storms can disrupt electrical grids, that biodiversity loss threatens food security, that digital records decay without maintenance. From that recognition, structures emerge. Underground vaults store seeds from crops across continents. Backup servers are placed in geographically separate regions. Critical knowledge is copied redundantly. Observatories watch the sky, not with fear, but with patience. Preparation, in this form, is almost humble. The viewer may begin to sense a subtle undercurrent. Perhaps these institutions are not predicting a specific catastrophic moment. Perhaps they are acknowledging something more foundational, that complexity demands foresight. Human systems have grown intricate. Interconnection strengthens prosperity but amplifies risk. Long-view planning becomes a necessity, not a luxury. Who, today, is quietly planning beyond the lifespan of our civilization? The question lands softly, without accusation. It does not imply hidden agendas. It points toward an emerging maturity within certain fields of knowledge, an understanding that history moves in longer arcs than daily politics. Preparation does not always look dramatic. It may appear as careful funding for climate research, sustained monitoring of cosmic radiation, or the simple act of preserving endangered languages and archives. Each initiative reflects an awareness that memory and continuity require active stewardship. The gentle unease lies here. If institutions feel compelled to think in centuries, perhaps they recognize that cycles are real, that resilience must be engineered deliberately, that the future will not unfold exactly as the present assumes. This awareness does not forecast doom. It acknowledges pattern. And if some institutions plan for long-duration uncertainty, another question follows naturally. Our civilization now rests heavily on digital memory. Archives, financial records, scientific data, all stored in formats dependent on infrastructure. How resilient is that infrastructure? To understand the fragility of our present memory systems, we must look closer at the foundation beneath the cloud and consider what happens if it falters. Walk through a modern library and the shelves feel thinner than they once did. The weight of knowledge has shifted elsewhere, into data centers, humming quietly beyond city limits, into server racks cooled by constant airflow, into distant facilities where light pulses through fiber as information moves from place to place. Nearly every discipline, every archive, every transaction now rests in electronic form. It feels permanent. Yet, digital memory is unlike stone or clay. A clay tablet buried beneath sand can survive millennia. A granite monument can endure wind and rain. Digital files, by contrast, require uninterrupted energy. They rely on functioning hardware, evolving software, stable climate control, and a chain of maintenance that must never fully break. Without power, servers fall silent. Without backups, corruption spreads unnoticed. Without migration across changing formats, files become unreadable as technology advances. A document stored perfectly today may be inaccessible tomorrow if its encoding no longer aligns with current systems. The vulnerability is subtle because it hides behind convenience, data. But beneath the surface lies infrastructure that is neither indestructible nor simple. Solar storms can disturb power grids. Electromagnetic disruption can damage circuitry. Cyber conflicts can compromise archives. Even ordinary decay, bit rot, magnetic degradation, hardware failure slowly erodes information unless actively maintained. What if the most documented era in history becomes the least recoverable after systemic disruption? The idea sounds paradoxical. How could a civilization that records everything be forgotten more easily than one that carved into stone? Yet permanence in the digital age depends on continuity. It assumes stable networks, consistent migration to new systems, and careful stewardship across generations. Ancient societies etched their memory into durable materials because that was their only option. Modern societies favor efficiency. Cloud storage replaces physical redundancy. Convenience replaces tangibility. In a world that stores everything in clouds, what happens when the clouds disperse? The question is not prophecy. It is physics and engineering. Data centers depend on cooling systems, power supply, secure access. If geopolitical strain, environmental stress, or economic disruption interrupts those systems for extended periods, vast archives could become inaccessible or corrupted. Even without dramatic events, gradual loss occurs. Formats become obsolete. Encryption keys are misplaced. Platforms shut down. Entire cultural eras stored on outdated media fade. Quietly when no compatible devices remain. The tone here remains reflective rather than alarmist. There is no imminent collapse announced. Instead, there is recognition that digital permanence is contingent. It requires vigilance. The paradox deepens. We generate more data each year than previous centuries combined. Yet much of it is ephemeral, inexperienced and fragile in structure. Social commentary, research, photographs, correspondence. All stored in forms dependent on electrical continuity. Imagine a future excavation thousands of years ahead. Archaeologists uncover fragments of plastic, metal, and glass from our era. Without functioning servers, what narratives survive? Printed books may persist. Stone inscriptions may endure, but the majority of contemporary communication could dissolve into silence. Future historians might know less about us than we know about the ancients whose monuments still stand. This thought carries neither accusation nor despair. It carries humility. Our civilization's memory is vast, yet delicately balanced. If fragility persists within our infrastructure, and if history demonstrates recurring cycles of contraction and renewal, the question becomes deeper than preservation technique. Is another reset inevitable? Or can awareness of vulnerability alter the rhythm? The final reflection of this chapter moves beyond storage devices and into choice itself. Across forests that have burned and grown again, across cities that have risen from rubble, one pattern becomes unmistakable. Collapse is rarely absolute. It rearranges rather than erases. It redirects rather than concludes. Each contraction reshapes trajectory, sometimes painfully, sometimes quietly, but rarely without consequence. If ecological, astronomical, and structural cycles exist, if complexity expands and tightens before releasing, then humanity stands in a rare position. For perhaps the first time, we possess enough global awareness to observe the pattern while still inside it. Ancient societies responded to disruption through myth, reconstruction, and simplification. Their resets may have unfolded without full comprehension of the forces at play. Today, climate models project decades ahead. Solar activity is tracked continuously. Geological risk is monitored in real time. Digital vulnerabilities are studied and mitigated. This awareness does not grant immunity. It grants perspective. Perhaps the question is no longer whether cycles occur. Perhaps cycles are embedded in the fabric of complex systems. The deeper question becomes how consciously we respond when signs of contraction appear. Will we deny the rhythm? Will we attempt to outpace it through expansion alone? Or will we design resilience with humility? What if remembering this pattern is the only way to break it? The engagement here is not rooted in fear. It rests in possibility. Recognition alters behavior. A society aware of its cyclical vulnerability might invest differently, plan differently, distribute memory differently. Instead of reacting to disruption with confusion, it might anticipate it with preparation. The idea is not utopian. Awareness does not eliminate strain, but it can reduce compression. It can preserve nuance. It can prevent entire chapters from dissolving into archetype. Humanity may be the first civilization capable of perceiving its own oscillation at planetary scale. Satellites map deforestation in real time. Economic data flows across continents instantly. Historical research synthesizes millennia in digital libraries. We possess both the tools to expand complexity and the insight to see its fragility. If there is another turning point in the long rhythm of civilization, perhaps it lies not in catastrophe, but in consciousness. The choice is not between collapse and continuity. It is between unconscious repetition and deliberate adaptation. Will we approach the next contraction, whether environmental, technological, or social, with denial or with preparedness? Will we allow memory to compress silently under pressure, or will we design systems to safeguard depth, even during strain? The tone settles gently, like twilight over ruins and modern skylines alike. There is no proclamation of impending reset. There is no dramatic forecast. Only recognition that cycles have shaped humanity before and may shape it again. In the quiet space between expansion and contraction lies decision. The ability to observe patterns grants a chance to respond differently. If this is another turning point in the long rhythm of civilization, will we meet it awake? The possibility lingers without resolution. Awareness alone does not guarantee outcome, yet it introduces a new variable into the ancient equation. As the chapter closes, attention turns toward the closing arc of this journey. Questions once whispered about forgotten wars and compressed timelines return. Is humanity rediscovering something older than its current story? And are those rediscoveries preparing us for what comes next? Across centuries of scholarship, certain questions have surfaced again and again. They appear in footnotes, conference debates, letters between researchers, quiet remarks at the edges of textbooks. They are examined carefully, framed within context, often provisionally explained. And yet, they return. Unusual construction precision that challenges assumptions about available tools. Sudden leaps in knowledge that seem to outpace gradual development. Chronological overlaps where cultures appear more interconnected than once believed. None of these elements overturn history, but neither do they dissolve entirely. What truly vanishes does not return. Yet some questions resurface generation after generation, as if they carry unfinished weight. One era frames them as curiosity, the next reframes them as anomaly. Later, new tools revisit them, offering refined measurements, alternative interpretations, deeper nuance. Why do certain mysteries of the ancient world refuse to stay settled? The documentary does not rush toward fringe speculation. It lingers instead on persistence. Across decades, mainstream frameworks have adjusted repeatedly in response to new evidence. Precision once deemed impossible becomes achievable with revised models. Cultural connections, once dismissed, grow clearer through comparative analysis. Dating methods evolve, refining timelines once thought fixed, and still, threads remain loose. Perhaps this is the nature of knowledge, incomplete, iterative, always reaching beyond itself. But there is something particularly compelling about questions that refuse to fade. They do not shout. They wait. What if the questions themselves are fragments of memory pushing upward? This engagement spike does not imply hidden censorship or deliberate concealment. It suggests a subtler dynamic. Just as individuals experience recurring thoughts when something unresolved remains beneath awareness, civilizations may revisit themes that were never fully processed. Students open textbooks and feel a quiet curiosity about gaps in explanation. Independent researchers revisit archival documents, long stored in quiet stacks. Advances in imaging, material analysis, and computational modeling re-examine findings once considered settled. The pattern becomes clear. Anomalies do not disappear. They pause. They await reinterpretation under new contexts and tools. Rather than framing this as conflict between establishment and outsiders, the narrative recognizes intellectual evolution. Knowledge matures by revisiting itself. Frameworks shift, not because they were wholly wrong, but because they were incomplete. In this way, the persistence of anomaly becomes a sign of vitality rather than instability. Questions returning across generations indicate unfinished dialogue with the past. The forgotten war, if such a period existed in any form, may not have been erased through fire or decree. It may have fragmented into subtle irregularities embedded within the record. Construction techniques that seem slightly ahead of their era, myths that carry strangely consistent motifs across distant lands, timelines that narrow at precisely the moment's complexity, appears to spike. Each anomaly alone is manageable. Together, they suggest depth. The contemplative tone remains steady. There is no dramatic unveiling, no conclusive revelation. Instead, there is humility. History is vast, Evidence accumulates gradually. Perhaps the forgotten war was never fully erased, only buried beneath layers of interpretation that suited stability at the time. As awareness grows and tools refine, those buried questions rise not as rebellion, but as invitation. They ask for re-examination, not upheaval. They whisper, rather than accuse. If unanswered questions persist across centuries, perhaps the incompleteness lies not solely in the past, but in the methods by which we frame memory. And if our approach to remembering is evolving in the digital age, more interconnected, more data-driven, yet also more filtered, the next inquiry must turn toward how narrative control itself adapts within modern systems. In earlier ages, memory thinned slowly. Catastrophe shattered continuity. Generations passed before fragmented stories hardened into myth. Compression required time, distance, and the patient erosion of detail. Today, something different is unfolding. Events travel instantly across the planet. A complex geopolitical shift becomes a headline within minutes. A nuanced scientific discovery condenses into a brief summary. A cultural debate compresses into a polarized exchange of phrases. Speed reshapes narrative. Social media cycles spin rapidly, rewarding brevity over depth. Nuance competes with urgency. Context competes with virality. Stories do not disappear because they are suppressed. They disappear because attention moves on. Ancient compression often followed disruption. Modern compression happens in real time. Can history fade? Not because it is destroyed, but because it becomes too simplified to recognize. The question does not accuse platforms or institutions of malice. It observes structure. Algorithms elevate content that engages immediately. Engagement favors clarity, certainty, strong framing. Complex ambiguity struggles to hold attention against simplified certainty. Over time, layers flatten. Long historical arcs shrink into bullet points. Intricate debates condense into opposing sides. Multi-causal explanations narrow into singular narratives. Even scholarly research must compete within shortened attention spans, adapting itself to digestible form. The concern is not suppression. It is distortion through reduction. In an age saturated with information, depth requires effort. Without that effort, collective memory risks becoming episodic rather than structural. Yesterday's carefully investigated report becomes today's forgotten scroll. What if we are witnessing a soft reset? Not through destruction, but through oversimplification. The engagement rests not in alarm, but in recognition. When stories compress repeatedly, over years and decades, complexity thins. Future generations may inherit archives filled with fragments rather than cohesive understanding. The paradox returns. The digital record expands endlessly, yet the lived experience of that record narrows. Vast quantities of information do not guarantee retention. They can overwhelm, encouraging selective recall based on convenience and resonance rather than comprehensiveness. In earlier resets, libraries burned. In ours, archives remain intact but diffuse. Meaning disperses across platforms and feeds, reassembled according to algorithmic priorities. The cumulative effect may resemble earlier patterns. Nuance softens. Ambiguity fades. Complex sequences condense into simplified epochs. Memory reset in the modern era may not require flames. It may require fragmentation. Imagine centuries from now, scholars examining our digital residue. They may uncover billions of data points, yet struggle to reconstruct sustained narratives. Without preserved context, fragments mislead. Trends overshadow underlying causes. The meditative tone here avoids fear. Humanity is not powerless before this pattern. Awareness alters behavior, intentional preservation efforts, long-form documentation, deliberate contextualization, all serve as counterweights. Still, the structure of rapid storytelling exerts quiet pressure. If complex truths are repeatedly simplified for accessibility, what happens to collective memory over generations? The question lingers gently. It does not condemn communication technology. It acknowledges that every era shapes memory differently. The risk lies not in losing all data, but in losing coherence. When coherence dissolves, reconstruction becomes difficult. If the present risks compressing its own narrative, then the final inquiry grows more focused. What might unfold if humanity were to fully uncover the deeper patterns of its forgotten cycles? And could such awareness reshape the arc ahead? Imagine, for a moment, that the uncertainty dissolved. Not anomaly, not inference. Definitive evidence emerges, inscriptions unmistakable, geological traces undeniable, synchronized records across continents, confirming a prior global collapse or forgotten war. The narrative humanity has carried for centuries would shift in a single generation. What would happen next? Would people panic at the thought that history is less stable than believed? Would denial rise first, a refusal to integrate destabilizing revelation, or would reflection follow, quiet and deliberate, as societies reassess their assumptions? History is more than record. It is identity. Nations anchor themselves to origin stories, cultures, root, meaning in continuity. Discovering that civilization had risen and fallen before our remembered beginning might unsettle the sense of linear ascent that defines modern progress. Yet the threat may not lie in the truth itself. What if the greatest threat is not the truth of a forgotten war, but our reaction to it? Shock can fracture, but awareness can deepen resilience. If evidence revealed a prior reset, humanity might confront fragility more honestly. Instead of assuming permanent advancement, societies might acknowledge oscillation as structural reality. The immediate response would likely vary. Some institutions would adapt, integrating new findings into revised chronologies. Scholars would debate interpretation carefully, striving for coherence. Media cycles would amplify reaction before settling into analysis. Individuals might experience something more intimate. The realization that human achievement is not a straight line, but a series of rises and returns, could inspire humility. It could temper arrogance. It could encourage long-term thinking, rooted in recognition of past vulnerability. If tomorrow we discovered that civilization had risen and fallen before, would it change how we live today? The question is not hypothetical alone. It probes psychology. Some may feel destabilized, perceiving prior collapse as warning of inevitable repetition. Others may feel empowered, understanding that humanity has survived profound contraction before. Institutions might fracture briefly under pressure to reinterpret foundational narratives. But history demonstrates adaptation. When new discoveries have emerged in the past, from heliocentrism to deep geological time, the broader story absorbed revision. The veil, if it exists, may not lift suddenly. It may thin gradually through accumulating evidence and shifting perspective. Awareness often arrives not as revelation, but as recontextualization. The deeper emotional question concerns meaning. If civilization is cyclical, does that diminish progress? Or does it enrich it, situating achievement within a broader arc of endurance? Modern humanity stands at an unusual point. We possess technological capability, advanced enough to examine our own deep past with precision. We can test materials at microscopic levels. We can model climatic shifts across millennia. We can compare myths across cultures instantly. We are equipped to question our own origin story. The culmination here is not a dramatic unveiling, but a quiet tension. Discovery of a forgotten reset would not erase current civilization. It would reshape narrative. It would add dimension to identity. Perhaps the real significance lies not in proving a forgotten war, but in expanding perspective, recognizing that humanity's path may include contraction as well as growth invites maturity. The veil may thin without tearing. As we approach the final chapter, the inquiry moves beyond whether such a reset occurred. It turns toward what it means to remember at all, and whether conscious remembrance can alter the rhythm that has guided civilizations for ages. The field is quiet again. Morning light spreads across grass that hides layers beneath it. Wind moves gently, as it did at the beginning of this journey, but the stillness now feels different. It is not empty, it is aware. Humanity walks forward carrying more than tools and language. It carries inheritance. Beneath cities lie earlier foundations. Beneath those foundations lie soil that once supported lives now unnamed. Children hear myths before they understand history. Calendars measure time, according to systems chosen long ago, accepted without daily thought. We inherit more than we realize. Fragments of forgotten structures remain beneath modern architecture. Stories once spoken around firelight echo faintly in cultural rituals. Astronomical markers set in stone centuries ago continue aligning with solstices and stars regardless of whether we notice them. Throughout this documentary, patterns have intertwined. Fractured timelines, synchronized collapses, psychological forgetting shaped by trauma and survival, institutional structures, simplifying narrative for cohesion, modern compression accelerating through digital speed. The threads do not prove a singular lost war with certainty. They reveal possibility, they reveal rhythm, they reveal humility. What if we are not the first civilization to believe we are the first? The thought lands softly across history. Societies have often framed themselves as pinnacle, culmination, final stage. Yet ruins across continents suggest that confidence has been voiced before. This is not indictment. It is perspective. Civilization may be less a straight ascent and more a relay. Each generation inherits fragments, preserved knowledge, reshaped myths, compressed timelines, omitted chapters. They interpret what they receive, add their own innovations, and pass forward a modified narrative. No society begins from zero. None carries the full record. Progress is real. Modern medicine, communication, science, and art demonstrate astonishing creativity. Human cooperation now spans continents in ways unimaginable to earlier ages. Innovation has reshaped daily existence profoundly, and yet permanence has never been guaranteed. The weight of inheritance carries both gift and burden. We inherit technological insight and cultural depth. We also inherit assumptions about continuity that history gently questions. Are we builders of something new or rebuilders of something forgotten? The answer may be layered. We build genuinely new systems, atop foundations, shaped by those before us. We innovate in ways unprecedented, yet within rhythms that echo through millennia. The reflective tone deepens as closure approaches. Civilization feels less like isolated achievement and more like ongoing conversation across time. Voices once silenced by collapse may still whisper through myths, monuments, and anomalies. There is dignity in this continuity. Survival across resets, whether dramatic or subtle, testifies to adaptability. Humanity persists not because it avoids every contraction, but because it learns, simplifies, and rebuilds. The quiet field holds no dramatic revelation. It holds continuity. Grass grows over foundations, new structures rise, old traces remain beneath. The sense of ending carries no certainty, only awareness. We are participants in a larger arc. The forgotten war, if it occurred in any form, may represent one turn of many. Inheritance shapes us, whether we recognize it or not. The final question now moves beyond pattern and possibility. If cycles exist, if memory compresses, if complexity breeds fragility, then inheritance alone is not destiny. Choice remains. And with choice comes the possibility, however uncertain, of altering the rhythm itself. For thousands of years, civilizations moved through cycles without seeing the full arc. They experienced expansion without recognizing fragility. They endured contraction without understanding pattern. Today, something is different. Humanity now observes itself at planetary scale. Satellites trace climate systems in motion. Predictive models simulate economic and ecological futures. Global communication allows ideas to travel instantly across borders. Archaeology reconstructs millennia within decades. For the first time, a civilization possesses tools capable of examining its own long-term vulnerability while still operating within it. What if this is the first time in history that humanity knows enough to prevent its own reset? The question introduces cautious hope, not naive optimism, but measured possibility. Awareness alters behavior. Knowledge of ecological limits encourages conservation. Understanding of solar and cosmic phenomena supports monitoring and preparation. Recognition of digital fragility inspires data vaults and redundant storage. Seed banks preserve biodiversity. International agreements attempt to manage shared risks. These actions do not guarantee immunity from disruption. They demonstrate foresight. Breaking the pattern may not mean eliminating contraction altogether. It may mean softening it, preserving continuity of memory even if complexity must narrow, protecting cultural depth even if systems strain. Resilience lies in redundancy. Knowledge stored in multiple formats, energy grids diversified, agriculture distributed, cultural narratives grounded in humility rather than permanence. Yet vulnerability remains, political divisions, fracture, consensus. Ecological strain accelerates unevenly, technological dependence deepens, digital infrastructure expands faster than its safeguards mature. Humanity holds tools powerful enough to protect continuity and powerful enough to magnify fragility. The balance is delicate. If memory resets have happened before, could remembering them be the key to ending the cycle? The engagement here moves beyond speculation into intention. Recognizing oscillation invites preparation. Understanding fragility encourages restraint. Accepting that permanence has never been guaranteed may temper overconfidence. Breaking the pattern does not require dominating nature or halting cosmic cycles. It may require integrating awareness into design, building systems that anticipate contraction rather than deny it, preserving nuance deliberately when simplification pressures rise. Modern humanity stands at a junction shaped by both inheritance and innovation. We carry fragments of prior ages, myths, monuments, reconstructed timelines, and we wield technologies unknown to them. The documentary has not sought to prove a forgotten war beyond doubt. Its purpose has been quieter, to illuminate pattern, to encourage humility, to invite reflection. Hope lies not in certainty of uninterrupted ascent, but in conscious adaptation. Civilizational resilience may depend less on avoiding strain, and more on maintaining depth when strain arrives. Awareness does not eliminate risk. It shifts response. Perhaps this era represents a threshold, not of destruction, but of integration. A moment when humanity recognizes its cyclical nature and chooses to design accordingly. The tone remains realistic. There are no promises, no declarations that history can be mastered entirely, but there is possibility. The rhythm of rise and return may continue, yet its amplitude could change. Compression may soften, memory may endure more fully, complexity may reorganize without dissolving completely. The final reflection now moves inward once more, beyond systems and cycles, towards something more fundamental. Not more. Not technology, the human condition itself, and what it means to remember. Dawn returns quietly. Light spreads across a field that could belong to any century. Grass bends beneath wind that has crossed ruins and skylines alike. In the distance, glass towers catch the rising sun. Somewhere beyond them, foundations older than memory rest beneath soil. Unnoticed, yet present. The journey began in stillness. It ends in the same stillness. Though it no longer feels empty, it feels layered. Throughout this exploration, questions have circled patiently. Was there a forgotten war, vast enough to fracture memory itself? Did civilizations compress their own histories in order to survive? Are cycles written, not only in soil and stone, but in the sky and in the structures of our own minds? No, single verdict emerges. Civilizations rise. They organize. They flourish. They strain. They contract. They reinterpret their past. They rebuild. Whether there was one great forgotten war, or many smaller contractions woven together over millennia, the pattern remains consistent. Memory thins, complexity narrows, narrative simplifies, yet life continues. Perhaps the true question is not who rewrote history, but why humanity continues to rise after every fall. The mystery shifts gently here. It is no longer about blame, or secret councils, or singular catastrophe. It is about resilience. Stone may crack, archives may burn, data may dissolve into silent circuitry. Calendars may reset, origin stories may shift, but across eras, humans have gathered fragments and constructed continuity once more. Children are born into simplified narratives and grow to question them. Researchers uncover buried structures and revise what they thought was certain. Communities restore meaning after disruption. The cycle is not only one of collapse, it is one of return. If there was a forgotten war, its most lasting legacy may not be destruction, but survival. If there were synchronized collapses, they did not end the human story. They redirected it. Morning light touches both ruins and towers without preference. The wind carries no archive, yet it moves across layers of inheritance. The next reset is not inevitable. A next dawn is not guaranteed. Both statements coexist. Awareness, however, has never been greater. Humanity observes its climate in real time. It monitors celestial behavior. It studies its own history with tools unimaginable to earlier ages. It recognizes fragility, even while expanding complexity. This recognition does not promise immunity. It offers responsibility. When the next dawn arrives, will it rise on ruins or remembrance? The answer rests not in prophecy, but in posture. Will we preserve depth deliberately? Will we design systems that anticipate strain? Will we carry humility rather than certainty about permanence? The film does not conclude with fear. It concludes with quiet obligation. Mystery opened the path. Evidence suggested pattern. Pattern revealed psychology. Psychology illuminated modern implication. Modern implication returned us to philosophical responsibility. The field remains. The skyline stands. Beneath them both lies the weight of inheritance. Civilization is not a single ascent. And whether this morning becomes another forgotten beginning or a conscious continuation depends less on what was hidden long ago and more on what we choose to remember now.